Careful on the heads.
And I put these in a box in there.
If I could pick anyone that I really want, would be the first year, 1936 Knucklehead.
He felt really, really bad. You'd go to see him in the nursing home, and how you do it, Frank, and one half of his body was completely done.
Look at that. That's cool. Frank Fritz was no ordinary collector, and his garage was no ordinary storage space. But what happened after his death stunned everyone, including the police. When they opened his garage, they didn't just find vintage cars. They found something else. A vehicle buried under dust and secrecy, one that, according to official records, shouldn't even exist. What was it doing there? And why did Frank leave behind a handwritten note, hinting at something much bigger? This wasn't just another hidden gem. It was a moment everything changed. Because what they discovered inside Frank Fritz's garage was far more shocking than anyone had ever imagined. The obsession. That's what drove him. Frank Fritz didn't just collect cars. He hunted them. He chased after stories wrapped in steel and chrome, tracing the rusted edges of forgotten decades. From the moment he first appeared on American Pickers, it was clear Frank wasn't in it for the fame. He was in it for the chase. He had a deep, personal love for things time left behind. And nothing spoke louder to him than a classic car with a story. To casual viewers, Frank was a quieter one, the guy with a quick wit and encyclopedic knowledge of gas station signs and oil cans. But for those who looked closer, the obsession was obvious. The way his voice changed when he saw a muscle car half buried in weeds, or how he lingered a little longer in someone's garage when something rare was parked inside. Frank didn't just buy cars. He saw value in them, something worth saving. Over the years, his private collection grew, not for show, but out of love. There was no fancy showroom, no velvet ropes, just a garage in Iowa filled with machines that felt like time capsules. A 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air with the iconic tail fins he always admired. A 1967 Ford Fairlane GT390 he bought for $7,000 and poured another $4,000 into restoring. A 1960 Cadillac Fleetwood, pure American luxury, purchased with his longtime friend Mike Wolfe. But it didn't stop there. Frank wasn't afraid to invest big in what he believed in. He owned two 1954 Nash Healey sports cars, bought for a combined $46,000. A rare 1914 Mert cycle car, a strange three-wheeled oddity worth around $35,000. And his crown jewel, a 1947 Cincinnati Nuvolari Spider, a post-war Italian masterpiece valued at more than $500,000. Each car came with a story, and Frank could remember them all, whether it was barn find, a grueling tow across states, or a late-night auction win. These weren't just vehicles. They were symbols of time, memory, and purpose. Frank didn't see them as investments. He saw them as rescue missions, proof that the past still mattered. Even as his fame grew, Frank never let it change the way he treated his passion. He didn't care about social media, didn't host flashy open houses. His garage remained private, locked tight, filled with grease, dust, and reverence. Friends said he would disappear in there for hours, tinkering with parts, cataloging, or simply sitting quietly among the cars he loved. In a world where everything is shared, streamed, and monetized, Frank chose silence, secrecy, intimacy, and that's where the mystery began. Not everything he found was filmed. Not every deal made it to American Pickers. As time went on, Frank became more private, more guarded. His garage, once a monument to his passion, became something else entirely. Even those closest to him didn't know what was locked behind those heavy doors. So when he passed, and those locks were finally broken, what they found inside shook everything we thought we knew. But before we reveal what they uncovered, it's important to understand just how deep Frank's obsession truly ran. Because for him, it was never really about the cars. It was about the idea that some things, some pieces of history, are worth holding on to no matter how many people forget they ever existed. A collector's final years. As Frank Fritz's presence on American Pickers began to fade, so did the public's view into his private world. What started as a slow withdrawal became something more permanent. By 2020, Frank had quietly exited the show, officially citing back surgery and personal health issues. At the time, fans assumed he'd eventually return. But behind the scenes, things were unraveling. His health wasn't just a temporary setback. It was part of a larger decline that cast a long shadow over his final years. Those close to him began to notice the changes. Frank became more isolated. He stopped taking many phone calls, limited visits, and spent most of his time alone at home. But his home wasn't typical. It was part museum, part sanctuary. His garage, once a space of restoration and purpose, turned into something quieter, more cryptic. He stopped talking about what was inside. Even friends who had known him for decades hadn't been inside for years. There were rare glimpses. A Facebook post showing his beloved 1939 Plymouth Coupe with a caption that hinted at his pride. Another post where he talked about restoring the Ford Fairlane, the way it growled when it finally roared back to life. But those updates soon stopped, and so did the contact. As his health worsened, the garage door stayed shut. Still, the collection continued to grow. Though he was no longer on the road for the show, Frank kept acquiring cars. Sometimes he sent someone to check them out for him. Other times, he bought them sight unseen. It wasn't reckless. It was instinct. He'd been doing it for decades. Each purchase still had purpose. One of the last confirmed acquisitions was a vehicle so obscure most people didn't even recognize it. No chrome, no muscle, just a strange shape, faded paint, and no visible markings. When a neighbor asked about it, Frank only said, "It's older than you think." Then he wheeled it into the garage and closed the door behind him. That was more than a year before he passed. What set Frank apart from other collectors was his philosophy. He didn't chase trends. He didn't hoard for the sake of it. He chased meaning. And that's what made his final years so mysterious. If he kept collecting, while sick, while mostly alone, what exactly was he chasing? There were rumors. Some said he had a secret list of vehicles tied to American automotive myths, one-off prototypes, race cars that had vanished, unfinished concepts. Others whispered about a retired GM employee Frank had been negotiating with, someone who allegedly had a factory car no one had seen since the 1960s. Nothing was ever confirmed. Just hushed speculation among antique auto enthusiasts. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. Frank had hinted at something. Before his death, he made cryptic remarks to old friends. In one conversation, he said, "There's something in that garage that'll outlive all of us." In another, he reportedly told someone, "If they ever open that garage without me, tell them I left everything behind." At the time, no one thought much of it. Frank had always been poetic like that. When the end came, it wasn't loud. No grand farewell. No press release. Just silence. A man who once lit up television screens across the country passed away quietly, surrounded by the only things that had ever truly understood him: solitude and stories waiting to be uncovered. And as a legal process began, and his property passed into the hands of estate handlers and investigators, all eyes turned to one place: the garage. Locked, quiet, undisturbed. Whatever he left behind wasn't just a collection of old cars. It was a record of a life spent chasing the rare, the forgotten, the impossible. And when the key finally turned and the doors creaked open for the first time in years, those standing closest to the case realized something incredible. Frank hadn't just been chasing the impossible. He had caught it and hidden it in plain sight. Underscore 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 underscore. The garage. Nobody could quite touch the atmosphere on the day they opened Frank Fritz's garage. There was an eerie kind of silence, not the respectful kind you hear at a memorial, but the kind that sinks deep into your bones when you realize you're about to step into something that's been left untouched for too long. Police officers stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, their hands resting on their belts, exchanging quiet, uncertain glances. The estate attorney held the key. Behind the heavy roll-up door, years of secrets waited. Until that moment, the garage had remained sealed under court order. It was part of the probate process, inventorying personal assets, verifying ownership, protecting anything valuable that might emerge. But no one expected what came next. From the outside, the garage looked unimpressive: a weathered steel frame, some ivy creeping along the edges, and a dented side door that hadn't been opened in years. But when the main door began to lift, inch by inch, dust poured out like smoke. And so did the weight of a legacy. Inside, 8 vehicles sat in tight formation. Some were covered in dusty tops. Others were exposed, their paint faded by time, but still striking in their shape. Near the front, the 1956 Bel Air stood proudly. The car that shouldn't exist. The turquoise body of the 1956 Bel Air stood proudly at the front, dull by time but still intact. Beside it, the 1967 Fairlane GT390, one of Frank's most prized muscle cars, sat with quiet authority. In the back left corner, the Cadillac Fleetwood shimmered with chrome and faded elegance. The space felt less like a garage and more like a time-frozen museum. But then came the twist, a vehicle no one recognized. Parked sideways near the back wall, hidden beneath a gray oil-stained tarp, was something that didn't match anything on Frank's known inventory. Its shape was strange, low-slung, aggressively curved, with a wide rear that looked more like a prototype than production model. One officer cautiously pulled back the tarp, and that's when everything changed. It was a Corvette, but not like any they had ever seen. Its design was more aggressive than a typical Stingray. The nose dipped unnaturally low, and the rear end flared wider than standard builds. Even more strange, there was no proper VIN plate in the usual locations. Instead, a small brass tag was riveted to the firewall, the faded lettering reading something untraceable, with a cryptic serial sequence that matched no official GM record. The police called it in. The estate attorney took notes. No one touched the vehicle after that, but everyone kept looking back at it, unable to shake the feeling that this was something much bigger. On the inside wall of the garage, just above the workbench and nearly obscured by years of dust and grime, was a yellowed note taped to the surface. The ink had bled, but one sentence was still legible. I left behind everything there. Signed simply, Frank. It didn't explain much, but it felt deliberate. A final clue, a whisper left behind for whoever came next. When a local mechanic was brought in to assess the collection, his focus narrowed on the unknown Corvette. He studied its lines, its build, and then said what everyone feared to think. This car wasn't supposed to exist. It resembled a 1963 Grand Sport, one of only 5 officially produced by Chevrolet before the project was canceled. All 5 were accounted for. And yet here it was, or something like it. And Frank had kept it buried. Questions spread fast. How did he acquire it? Why did he hide it? Why didn't he tell anyone? Not fans, not collectors, not even his closest friends. The garage that no one was allowed to enter had just revealed its first secret, and it was a game changer. But it was only the beginning. Underscore 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 underscore. The car that shouldn't exist continued. When the garage door finally groaned open and the dust began to settle, no one expected to find anything beyond what they already knew Frank Fritz owned. His 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air, the 1967 Fairlane GT390, the 2 Nash Healey sports cars, the legendary Sicilian Nuvolari Spider. All of them well documented, admired, and catalogued by collectors and auto enthusiasts over the years. But in the back, under a tarp, was something no one had seen before. A Corvette, but wrong. The body was fiberglass, the stance low, the curves exaggerated. The fenders bulged like something built for the track. When they peeled the cover back, confusion filled the room. The bodywork matched a 1963 Grand Sport, a Corvette so rare that only 5 were ever made before the project was killed by GM. All 5 were known. All 5 were accounted for. So what was this? There was no VIN in the usual place. Just a small brass plate hand stamp with the words experimental use only and a string of strange numbers. The fiberglass felt correct. The chassis looked legitimate but was unlisted. The more experts examined it, the more baffling it became. Frank had never mentioned this car, not in interviews, not in American Pickers episodes, not in any behind-the-scenes stories. He, a man known for his openness about the thrill of the hunt, had kept this one thing absolutely silent. And then, that note above his workbench took on a new meaning. I left behind everything there. At first, it had read like a sentimental goodbye. But now, with his Corvette found under wraps, it felt like a riddle, a deliberate message, a final mystery, Speculation exploded online and in collector circles. Some believed it was one of the rumored lost mules, test cars built alongside the Grand Sport but never officially acknowledged. Others claimed it was even stranger, a one-off prototype built in secret by rogue GM engineers, using original molds hidden away for decades. Somehow, it had found its way to Frank. What's certain is that Frank knew exactly what he had. He protected it, never registered it, never showed it, and positioned it in the farthest, darkest corner of his garage, not as a showpiece, but like something he was safeguarding, something sacred. And now, after his death, it had finally come into the light. The discovery triggered a flood of attention. Corvette historians, automotive archivists, former GM employees. Theories collided. Some called it the most convincing replica ever made. Others dared to say it could rewrite Corvette history itself. But one thing was undeniable. Frank Fritz had kept the secret to himself right to the end. In the end, it wasn't the money, the brand, or even the car itself that made the find so extraordinary. It was the impossibility of it. That a man who spent his life rescuing the rare and forgotten had died with one final story tucked behind a locked door, a story that might just change everything we thought we knew about American car history. 4 wheels, a brass tag, and a legacy built not on what was shown, but on what was hidden. Questions that still linger. The discovery of the mysterious Corvette didn't just spark curiosity. It cracked open a vault of unanswered questions that no one, not even Frank Fritz's closest friends, seemed prepared to face. This wasn't just about identifying a rare vehicle. It was about understanding why it was hidden, how it ended up in Frank's garage, and whether it was ever meant to be found at all. Once news of the car hit niche automotive forums, the buzz spread rapidly. Vintage racing communities dissected it photo by photo. Corvette historians scoured decades of records, comparing every visible detail to known prototypes, mule cars, and sketches from Chevrolet's brief but legendary Grand Sport program. Yet every answer only deepened the mystery. The central question remained, was it real? If the car was an authentic, undocumented Grand Sport prototype, then Frank had managed to obtain a vehicle General Motors had never acknowledged, an automotive ghost. But if it was a replica or a Frankenstein build crafted from original blueprints or smuggled factory parts, an even more chilling question emerged. Who built it? The craftsmanship was anything but amateur. The lines were precise, the materials era-correct, and the welds were expertly done. It bore the signature of someone who had access, knowledge, and purpose. Rumors began to swell. One insider claimed Frank had purchased the shell and original components from a retired GM engineer in the early 2000s, long before his health declined. Another whispered about a discreet deal at an estate sale near Flint, Michigan, not far from former GM grounds. These stories couldn't be confirmed, but they wouldn't go away either. In fact, they matched Frank's style. He never collected for applause. He was drawn to the obscure, the forgotten, the hidden. His garage wasn't a showroom, it was a sanctuary, and that made it the perfect hiding place for something like this. But what unsettled people most wasn't the car, it was the silence that followed. GM refused to release any public statement. When pressed, a spokesperson flatly said they had no information regarding any such vehicle. Behind the scenes, former engineers and auto insiders speculated that more Grand Sports might have been built than the 5 officially acknowledged. Maybe they were stashed away off the books for testing and quietly scattered when the program was terminated. If Frank's car was one of those, then its existence was a leak in a story that GM had buried for decades. And then there was a note again. I left behind everything there. The more people read it, the more intentional it seemed. A breadcrumb. Maybe Frank wanted this to be found. Maybe he knew exactly what kind of storm would follow, and this was his way of ensuring the chase lived on. Or maybe it was just his last joke, one final twist from a man who built a life around discovering what everyone else missed. As word spread, offers began pouring in. Museums expressed interest. Wealthy collectors made unsolicited offers, some in the 6- and 7-figure range. One international buyer reportedly offered a blank check. Yet, for now, the estate held off. The car remains untouched, trapped in legal limbo, surrounded by a growing circle of experts, skeptics, and lawyers who still can't explain what exactly Frank Fritz left behind, or why. Legacy and silence. No one can agree on exactly what the car is, and Frank Fritz never said a word about it while he was alive. That silence lingers. In every interview he gave, every episode he filmed, there's no mention, no hint, no accidental glance. He kept it hidden not because he was forced to, but because he chose to. Whether it was a lost prototype, a factory ghost, or the greatest automotive hoax in history, the truth remains locked away, just like that garage once was. And maybe that's exactly how Frank wanted it. Not everything he discovered was meant to be explained. Some things were just meant to be found. Long after the garage was inventoried and the estate proceedings began, the car remained right where it had been uncovered, silent, untouched, and impossible to ignore. Experts came and went, each more fascinated than the last, but none could deliver a definitive answer. Too many variables, too few facts, and Frank wasn't around to fill in the blanks. That's what makes this story different. It isn't just about a rare car. It's about the man who kept it hidden and the mystery he wrapped around it. Frank Fritz never lived like a typical collector. He didn't chase fame or flaunt value. He collected for the thrill of the find, for the quiet, personal satisfaction of knowing he'd rescued something the world had forgotten. This final discovery, whether an undocumented grand sport or one-of-a-kind recreation, embodies everything Frank stood for: mystery, history, and reverence for beauty lost in time. He didn't tell anyone about it, and maybe that was the whole point. Maybe he wasn't waiting for recognition. Maybe he was just content knowing it was safe, waiting for someone with the right eyes to see it. In death, Frank left behind more than cars or antiques. He left behind questions, a message that collecting isn't always about showing off what you found. Sometimes it's about knowing something exists and quietly protecting it, keeping it exactly where it belongs. And that car, the one that shouldn't exist, is now part of his legacy. Whether it's ever verified or remains an unsolved mystery, it carries Frank's spirit more than any documented antique ever could. Because in the end, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about preserving something. Something that didn't need an audience, just a locked door, a dusty garage, and a man who understood the power of what's left unsaid. What did you admire most about Frank Fritz? Let us know in the comments.